Hey, everybody. Welcome to She Ventures Out, the podcast where we are all about navigating life's many transitions. I'm your host, Qiana Williams, executive coach, author, and I am here to guide you through the ups, downs, and glorious in-betweens of stepping into your boldest, most unapologetically brilliant self. So today we are talking about something that I feel like people ask me about all the time. So whether, people are reaching out to me as a coach or sending us notes about the podcast, or even when I was still inside an organization, I think the number one thing people ask me about is how to make a pivot in your career. So how to launch into something new, be that a new job, a new industry, whatever. And so, I know a lot of times when people are thinking about making pivots, it's because you're feeling stuck or you're itching to do something new, or maybe life just lifed and an opportunity came your way that was disguised as a bit of a detour. Been there. And now you're trying to figure out what's next. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And let me just start out by saying right up front, I think a lot of times when people think about a pivot, they think that this is a failure, right? And I want to dispel that notion right off the rip. Career pivots are not failures. It's not about stepping back. It's not about, having to start over. To me, a pivot is about stepping toward the version of yourself that's honestly been waiting to be unlocked. And let me tell you from personal experience, I know that it is not only possible, but that you can do it with confidence, clarity, and purpose. So buckle up and let's get ready to dive in. So, first, let's talk a little bit about why people pivot. So, when I think about this idea of pivoting, it often is, some moment that has happened in our lives, right? Some moment that is propelling us towards something new. So, I talked earlier, right? It could be you're feeling stuck, right? Like you've been on autopilot in your job and quite frankly, it no longer excites you. Or, maybe you've been, finally kind of gotten burnt out by this incessant grind and you're trying to decide how do you take some steps back because what you are giving is not feeling commiserate to what you are receiving. Or maybe you're feeling like your industry is shifting, right? You're starting to feel like the skills you have, the things that you've mastered aren't as relevant as they once were. Or maybe, and this is something that, I've experienced before, you've discovered a new passion that truly lights you up. Something that you just feel so drawn to, that feels so magnetic, that feels so inherent to who you are, but it feels like there's a disconnect from the life that you're living right now. So whatever the reason, one of the ones I just said or something else, the thing that I want you to know is that a career pivot isn't about giving up. It's about leveling up to match your purpose, right? Because I know that a lot of times when we think about these pivots, right, like there are these stories that we're telling ourselves in the back of our head around what other people are going to think about this pivot or what we're thinking about this pivot. And I want you to just go ahead and put out of your mind anything other than this pivot is about me stepping into my highest self. And I think one of the things that hopefully will help you kind of wrap your mind around this idea is your career isn't a ladder, right? I know that, a lot of us growing up kind of got that vision in our head that is just one rung after the other, but it really is more akin to a jungle gym. So, You're allowed to kind of move to this bar, so swing over this way. You're allowed to swing back over this way, step up, step back, right? Like when you're on a jungle gym, right? Like you're free to move in a lot of different directions. And that's really how we should think about our careers. So when we think about a career pivot in this way, we understand that it isn't about giving up, it's about leveling up to match our purpose. So here's the thing. I know, right? The mere fact that you are thinking about pivoting tells me that you are mentally ready. But what's so important to me is that we don't just leap, right? Because a lot of times we see something shiny, we see something that feels like it resonates with who we are, and we just leap. And what I want us to start doing is leaping in a way that we are prepared for, right? And so there's some steps that I believe that if you do these things, it prepares you better for the pivot. So the first thing that I always recommend is to do a self-assessment. And you can do this in a number of different ways, right? Like there are assessments that are, available to you. I've shared before, that, I'm certified in Hogan, certified in DISC. All of those types of assessments can help you get really clear on what it is that you're wanting to do next, kind of what aligns with your personality, what aligns with your passion. And so, feel free to reach out to me or another coach to do that. But you can also do a self-assessment, right? Not necessarily as robust as those tools, but it will still help you kind of get on track and start thinking about how you should think about this pivot. So you're going to ask yourself things like, what do I love doing? What am I naturally good at? What lights me up, right? What is the kind of work that I get lost in, right? And forget that, I'm doing something. And what are the things that are non negotiable for me in a job? And the reason why I think these questions are so important is because they start to help us identify what are our transferable skills, but also what are our passions. Because one of the things you might realize is that the things you're already great at, like problem solving or storytelling or connecting with people, can actually apply to a whole new role or industry. And it's all about how you position those things, right? So, first step, self assess, get really clear on the things that you do well, the things that you want to do, and what your next opportunity needs to hold. And I talk about this in more detail in my book, When at Work. But for me, this self assessment is so key and really has to be the starting place. And so then next, what I want you to do is I want you to do research. I want you to learn everything that you can about the field or the role you're interested in. And the reason why I think this is so important is because getting clear on what are the skills that are in demand, what certifications or experience will allow you to stand out is really going to be key in your positioning, right? The other thing that I think is important about this is a lot of times people think something looks sexy, people think something looks like what they want to do, but then when they start to research it, they get a better understanding of what the job actually is, what the field actually does, and then start to get clear on, is that really what I want to do? So for instance, one of the things that, people always reach out to me about is how to get into HR. So, people who have been outside of HR, will say, hey, I know that you've led HR, you have a ton of HR in your background. I really want to get into HR. Can you help me do that? And my first question always is, why do you want to get into HR? And baby, if somebody starts off by saying, because I love people, I ask them to dig deeper because being in HR will challenge your love of people. Being a people lover is not the number one prerequisite for being in HR, because being in HR, you are going to see all sides of people, right? You are going to see people at their best, but you are also going to see people at their worst. And being able to manage all those sides of people is an art and a science. And so just loving people, to me, is not enough to say, I want to make my career in HR. The other thing I think a lot of times, just to stay on that soapbox for just a minute longer, I think a lot of times people feel like they have had bad experiences with HR. And so they're like, I want to go into HR because I'm going to show you what HR should really look like. And I think there's always a place for somebody who is innovative, who is thoughtful, all of those types of things. But I also think that there is something about coming into a space and saying, I want to overhaul it without truly understanding the work and truly understanding, what it takes to be a great HR person in this particular example. And so that's why research is so key. So getting beyond the sexiness of why you're interested in a new role or why you're interested in a new industry, and truly understanding what a day in that industry is like through that research, I think is so critical to making that pivot. So, reach out to people. And that brings me to the next step, which is networking, right? You knew it was coming. And I know for some of y'all, and sometimes it's me as well, networking is for the birds. But hear me out. Uh, We have to build connections, right? There is no job at this point in time where relationship building connections, isn't a prerequisite. And so being able to do that is one of the quickest ways, not only to understand a field, but break into a field, right? And so I want us all to take a deep breath. Those of us who, don't always, run towards networking opportunities, and think of doing this as a means to an end, right? Building connections, building relationships, learning more about people and the work that they're doing in order to figure out, how you can potentially get a foot in the door in that particular field or industry. And so, but for those of us who, don't always gravitate toward, those networking opportunities, I want you to start easy, right? So start with the people that you know. So, figure out, do I know anybody who's in this field that I want to go into? Do I know anybody, who is close to somebody who's in there? And start to build connections that way. Reach out to people who you know to do informational interviews, to ask them to connect you to somebody who can do an informational interview with you. Obviously, join professional groups, attend industry events. And, remember, LinkedIn is out there, right? LinkedIn is a powerful tool for connecting with people and doing research. And we should leverage that to the degree that it is going to help us. I know a lot of times people say, well, what if I don't know this person? I think there's a certain expectation, or there's a certain allowance. I think that's the better word. I think there's a certain allowance that we all extend on LinkedIn, because it is about seeing, kind of how many degrees of separation exists between us so that we can start to make connections. So, for instance, when people reach out to me on LinkedIn, and ask, to get together or for information or whatever, I'm open to it because I assume that's what LinkedIn is for, right? I assume that people are going to be seeking connection, are going to be looking for professional opportunities. And that's what the tool is for. And I think most people feel the same. So make sure you leverage LinkedIn. And then finally, and what I think is the biggest step towards making that pivot, is starting to shift your mindset. When I think of the people who have pivoted well and pivoted best, it is those people who understand that a pivot requires you to embrace imperfection, to see change as an opportunity, not a threat, and to know that some level of fear is normal, right? But staying in a space of curiosity is stronger. And so, what I want you to take away is that your next career move, right? The pivot that you are desiring is already within you. It just needs the courage to be revealed. And that's the work that you have to do. So, let's talk a little bit about what makes people nervous about actually making the pivot. And I think the first thing that we have to agree on is that you're going to start small, right? I mean, a lot of times, and I've talked about this in other episodes, right? Like we think we got to make this huge leap. I have pivoted multiple times in my career. So I graduated undergrad thinking that I was going to go into criminology. I wanted to be a probation officer. I went on my first job interview, and it was a lot more corrections than rehabilitation. And I knew in that moment that that wasn't for me. And so I started trying to figure out, okay, I have this degree. I don't have a plan B. What am I going to do? So I started temping. I temped at, Huntington National Bank. Saw this woman every single day coming in and out, just dynamic. I may have told this story before. It's super dynamic. And she's a Black woman. And so I was just immediately drawn to her because, I had never been in a career space like this before. And one day I got up the nerve, right? I got up the nerve and I stopped her and I said, "What is it that you do?" Because y'all, like the thing that was happening inside of me was whatever she's doing, that's what I want to do. The job that she has that lets her move through these halls so dynamic, so in control, like so full of charisma. Like people would always stop her, ask her questions. Like she just seemed like to be so self-possessed. And as a young woman, fresh out of undergrad, who did not know what next was going to be, that's what I wanted to embody. And so I stopped her and I asked her, I said, "What is your job?" And she told me, she said, "I'm an HR generalist." And I said, "Thanks." And I started researching what is an HR generalist and how do I do that? And so y'all know the rest of the story is, I moved into HR and, have done that for the majority of my career, went all the way to the top, leading HR for a major organization. All because, right, I decided to, step out of my fear in that moment, ask this woman who didn't know me from Adam about her career, and then I did the research. So that's what I'm talking about around starting small. Right, you don't have to go all in right away. You can test the waters, take on a freelance project, maybe volunteer. And so what I did in that instance, right, I was temping as the receptionist in the HR department. Then I started looking for HR assistant roles and decided that, I was going to go back to school and get, a master's in human resources to, kind of firmly put myself in the space. And all of these small steps start to allow you to build confidence, right? It allows you to build your skills and you're building connections without putting everything on the line, right? And as I was doing those things, right, I started to get more and more confident about my ability to be an HR professional. Then you got to own your story. A lot of times when we are transitioning into a new field, we have to reframe our experience for this new audience. So, one of the things I want folks to do, right, I want you to think about is think of your resume or your LinkedIn profile or even, the elevator pitch that you might give to someone as a highlight reel. So a lot of times people will start by saying something like, well, I don't have experience in this industry, or I've spent years developing skills that are perfect for, excuse me, or instead, what I want you to say is I've spent years developing skills that are perfect for this role. Because a lot of times, what we're doing by discounting our previous experience is we're not seeing what those transferable skills are. We're not seeing how the things that we have developed in another industry actually have correlation to the industry that we're trying to pivot into. So another example, so I mentioned, I worked in, financial services, and then I moved into healthcare. So, that first HR assistant role was at a healthcare organization. And that's when I decided I was going to go back and get my master's, and then left that organization and went back into financial services. Did that for a little while, then went into a nonprofit organization, then saw an opportunity in fashion and retail. I had no fashion or retail experience, but I had HR background. And so what I had to do is I had to figure out how to position my experience in a way that had resonance in this retail environment, because it wasn't enough for me just to say I know HR, because when anyone who's worked in retail knows that they're looking for somebody who's, accustomed to a fast-paced type work style. And I had to look back over what I had done, right, in my experience, to be able to position myself for the interview so that they would say, she's more than, like her nonprofit experience isn't what defines her, right? Because that was the experience that I had right before I was applying for this job. And so then I spent about 5 years at the retail company. Actually, I think it was about 7, and then decided that I wanted to pivot again. Right. And so once again, I had to figure out how I was looking at the breadth and depth of my experience and positioning it in a way. So, moral of the story, I have pivoted industries multiple times. And each time I had to tell a story to get my foot in the door with the recruiters, to get in my foot in the door with the hiring manager, and help them understand how my experience translated into the thing that they were doing. And so, one quick example, so when I was moving from retail to healthcare, it was during a time where healthcare was looking to embody more principles from a retail standpoint. The way that I knew that was because I had done that research. So remember when I talked about doing research earlier, because I had done that research and I understood that the healthcare model was shifting, and having the retail experience that I had was in line with where they were shifting to. And so I used that to position my experience as someone who understood retail and could bring that lens to the healthcare environment. And I got the job, y'all. So finally, the last step I want you to think about is, how can you take some strategic risk? So you're never going to feel 100% ready. And by now, you should know what my motto is going to be. That is okay, right? Because we're never 100% ready. Apply for the job anyway, even if you don't meet every qualification. Reach out to a mentor or, sponsor who you think is out of your league. Do it anyway. Invest in certification or a coach. I'm going to keep underscoring that, right? All of those things are strategic risk, but they have high upside, right? Because the mentor may say yes, right? This is somebody who, you felt like was out of reach. And the reason why you felt like they were out of reach was because they had a depth of experience, they had a breadth of knowledge, they had, done the job that want to do in 5 years, all of those types of things. If you can land that person, right, just think of the wealth of knowledge and information that you're going to receive from them. But if you never reach out, you're never going to know. And so that's why it's so important. The other thing is, investing in certifications, right? So I talked about going back to school to get the HR degree, again, to firmly place myself in people's mind as an HR professional. Now, again, all of these things are strategic risk, right? I want you to be thoughtful about that. For instance, there at one point in my career, someone, had shared with me that they thought that I needed to do a tour in a particular area of HR in order to be the head of HR, to be a CHRO. And so I agreed to do it. I found it to be very valuable. I learned a lot. But there are people all around me who have gotten to CHRO who never did that, right? The person who told me that I need to do it, put people in CHRO positions who had never done it, right? And so that's why I'm saying be strategic, right? Every investment isn't necessarily an investment that you need to make. You have to be discerning. You have to make sure that the step that you're taking is the right step for getting you where you want to go. And sometimes that might mean that you have to go somewhere else, right? And so I just want you to be thoughtful as you are making those moves, because these investments, right, require us to, invest dollars, invest time, invest, moments in our career. And so making sure that we are doing those in an intentional way is really important, which is also why, I talk about, potentially getting a coach, because a coach can also help you kind of sort through what is the right next move for myself. So remember, every pivot that you take starts with one brave step forward. And as I said in last episode, or 2 episodes ago, you don't have to know every step to take the next step, right? You just have to take that first brave step forward, and the rest will unfold as you move. So don't fear, starting over, right? Don't allow that fear to stop you from building something extraordinary, because, as I've always said, you have it in you. So how do you make this practical, right? Like at the end of the day, you know, that's what we're here for, right? As She Ventures Out, we're all about how do you take these nuggets and make them practical in order to move your pivot with purpose. So number one, I'm always going to, suggest, starting out by writing things down, right? So some questions that you should answer for yourself is, what does my ideal workday look like? What impact do I want to make in the world? And how do I want my job, my position, my career to enable that? And one of the things I think is so important is this idea of, what am I willing to let go of to make room for something new? Because there's always going to be a level of give and take, right? And we have to get really clear about what it is that we are willing to let go of to make room for that new thing that we want to do. So, I used to tell people this story all the time. So when I worked in retail, had this great boss, and whenever things were just kind of not going well, he would gather us all and he'd say, "Hey guys, we're not curing cancer. It's just bras and panties." And this was his way of trying to, kind of calm us all down or make us all feel better. And one day I pulled him to the side and I said, "I know that that's meant to be a pep talk, but I want to cure cancer." And that conversation was a realization for me about the type of environment I needed to be in. I needed to be in an environment that allowed me to see the very powerful fruits of my work, right? The work of HR as enabling culture in order to allow, really smart people, doctors, physicians who, were really connected to something powerful to make this big difference in the world. And so what I had to what I had to be willing to let go of is this very wonderful 40% discount that the organization that I was working in, right, had. I had to be willing to let go of, being in an environment that I knew where, I was climbing the ladder, right? I had to be willing to let go of all of those things to go find a place that enabled me to be connected to work that I felt like was transforming people's lives. So then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to start to set goals, right? When you start to break your pivot into small, achievable steps, then you start to see progress. So something like in the next 30 days, I'll reach out to 5 people in my target industry. In the next 60 days, I'm going to reach out to that mentor who, feels like a big catch and see if I can get some time with them. Then I want you to invest in professional branding. So update your resume, polish your LinkedIn profile. If the field that you want to go into requires it, develop a portfolio, develop a CV, all of those things. And it's really important that you do those things with that lens towards how am I thinking about this pivot aligning to my previous experience, right? Because we're not throwing all that previous experience away because this is a new space. We're looking to see what the transferable skills are. How can I position the work that I've been doing all this time in a way that aligns with the space that I want to go into? So the thing that the kind of the mantra, right, that I want you to embody as you're thinking about this is I have the skills, courage, and adaptability to thrive in any path I choose. Right. So put it on a Post-it note, stick it somewhere where you're going to see it every day, right? Because those are the seeds that you want to plant in your mind as you get ready for this pivot. Okay, so before we wrap up, I want you to remember this. A pivot is not just about changing your career, it truly is about rediscovering yourself and connecting to the next level of who you are. It's about stepping into alignment with what you're meant to be, with who you're meant to be and what you're meant to do. And yes, it can be scary. Yes, it takes work, but what's waiting on the other side is absolutely worth it. And you are worth it. You are worth living your best life. You are worth taking the reins of this big dream that you have and putting one foot in front of the other until you get there. So here is my challenge for you. So if you are ready to make that next pivot over the next 30 days, I just want you to think about what is one small step toward that pivot you can make every single day. That might be reaching out to that mentor we talked about, updating your LinkedIn, reaching out to me or another coach, journaling about your dream job, right? Because we've been talking about writing it down, visualizing it, whatever it is, I want you to take that step and I want you to commit for 30 days to do something every single day that moves you in that direction. Because at the end of the day, your next chapter is waiting, right? It is waiting for you to decide to turn the page because it already knows how amazing it's going to be. It's just asking you to catch up with that. Okay? All right, everybody, that is today's episode. As always, thank you so much for joining me on She Ventures Out. If you love this episode, as always, I'm asking you to share it with a friend who needs the encouragement in their pivot. And don't forget to leave us a review. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And until next time, keep venturing out. Keep choosing to be your most unapologetically brilliant self. Okay, y'all. I'll see you next time.
Boxland Media. Think big.